going to be reading some excerpts from my book. And before I do that, I want to just let you know that one of the things I'm going to be reading is the quote that inspired the title of the book. So that, as you see, it's entitled Strength of Soul. And that comes from a quote by the poet Adrienne Rich. So I'm going to be reading that quote. And some of it might be a little hard to understand, the wording in the quote. So I'm happy to discuss that further once I'm in the conversation with Ms. Porchy. I'm also going to be reading my preface, so essentially my inspiration, the reason I wrote this book, what inspired me to write this book. And I'm also going to read 2 chapters. They're not long. So without further ado, Strength of Soul. Para Sebastián, and dedicated to my family, past, present, and future. Ever since my father died, as I have adjusted to life without his physical presence, the sun has shone in moments I have missed him most. I genuinely feel my father's presence in the sun, and it has always managed not only to bring me light, but to give me strength. Having my son paint this art symbolizes that he too is my light and my strength, and that bringing him into the world is the catalyst for this book. So my son is the reason I wrote this book in essence. He really is my, as I said, my strength, my light, my inspiration. And he drew that sun, he painted that sun that you see on the book cover, which was also designed by my husband. So it was a family affair. So here's the quote. When someone, with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. Yet you know you exist, and others like you, that this is a game done with mirrors. It takes some strength of soul, and not just individual strength, but collective understanding, to resist this void and to stand up, demanding to be seen and heard. Adrienne Rich, Blood, Bread, and Poetry, Selected Prose, 1979 to 1985. Can you guys hear me well with the mic? Should I lower it? Are you good? You good? Okay. Preface. When my son opened his eyes for the first time in December 2010, and my father's permanently closed in November 2011, I was thrust into a re-examination of my identity. I was now a mother and a fatherless daughter. My light-skinned, blonde, blue-green-eyed son reminded me in many ways of the beloved father I had lost. And as I adjusted to my new normal, I began to take stock of my history and of my future. As I took stock, I thought a great deal about the racism and erasure I had experienced my entire life as a bilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-citizenship individual living in the United States. The transformative experience of bringing my son into the world and saying goodbye to the father who had in part produced us both propelled me to truly examine systemic racism and its perpetuation. My son needs to see his story reflected in the printed word. It is only through seeing his family's complex history reflected that he will be able to see himself and others in totality. Our stories are not written on our faces. A criminal justice lawyer and author named Bryan Stevenson, whose work focuses on the history of lynching and its connection to modern-day police brutality in our criminal justice system, once said, I am persuaded that we really won't eliminate the problems of discrimination in the criminal justice system, in the education system, in the employment system, until we change the narrative of racial difference that we have all accepted. Stevenson, 2016. Chapter 11, The Narrative of Racial Difference. The narrative of racial difference that Bryan Stevenson described is what allowed for people to dismiss my brother and me as our father's biological children, and what allows for people to dismiss me as my son's biological mother. Generations after slavery, our society perpetuates the belief that skin color equates race. I have had countless experiences of how our society's ideology of inherent racial difference has informed people's reactions to and interactions with my family. I did not recognize these moments as reflective of our country's ideology of racial difference, however, until after I became a mother. When my son was about 3 years old, we were waiting on a train platform in Manhattan. I noticed a woman admiring my son. I gave her a small smile, but she returned, and then, seeming to feel that I was approachable, said to me, "He is so cute. How long have you looked after him?" I responded, "Since he was in utero." I did not say it snidely or dismissively. I said it with conviction, as it is the only true answer to her question. Her face became pale with embarrassment. Faltering some, she said, "Oh, he's yours? I'm so sorry." The assumption that woman made about me being my son's caretaker and never even entertaining the possibility that I could be his mother carries with it our history of colonialism, oppression, and systemic racism. Many people in our society are completely unaware of how the assumptions they make about others are absolutely informed by our history. Although it is exhausting to be so attuned to what the assumptions made about me and my family truly belie, I am grateful for the awareness, because it does not allow a destructive ideology to define my sense of self or how I raise my son. My father was treated for his pancreatic cancer at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, and though he was weak, he always loved to walk, so he would often go for short walks with one of us down the hospital corridors. On one of those occasions, walking with my dying father, we ran into a nurse who had been caring for him, but who had not yet met his family. She greeted him, never once looking at me, and innocently asked, "Is this your new nurse?" My father, despite his proximity to death, mustered what little strength he had and proudly stated, "No, she's my daughter." The nurse reddened and apologized, just as the woman on the train platform had. Both experiences, however, taught me not only of an acceptance of an ideology of racial difference, but of an elevation of whiteness and a devaluation of blackness and brownness. In both interactions, I was presumed to be an employee. And with my father, it was as if I did not exist at all. The vastly different assumptions of my father being my adoptive father versus me being my biological son's caretaker reflect this elevation of whiteness and devaluation of blackness and brownness. To adopt a child is an economic privilege. It also harks back to our history of colonialism, to the belief that this white man has saved these brown children. People would take one look at my father's skin color and one look at ours, and within moments, all of these historical, cultural truths would be unmasked. With my son, however, the assumption that I am in essence employed by his white family also speaks to the associations we have of who is privileged and empowered, as well as to our history of colonialism and oppression. My brown face tells people that I am my son's nanny, as for generations, black and brown women have looked after, often in fact raised, white children. Many black and brown women continue to care for and often bring up white children. So it is not unimaginable for people to assume I am my son's caretaker. With that said, however, it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that as a result of an ideology of racial difference and white supremacy, white people are more often than not in positions of power, and black and brown people are not. The narrative of racial difference must change, because it is not only the foundation of systemic racism, it is the source of its perpetuation. Chapter 12, unsolicited questions, unsolicited commentary. The stories I shared in chapter 11 are only a snippet of what I've experienced out in the world with my family. The truth is, I have spent a lifetime on the receiving end of questions and comments about my existence. These come from white, black, and brown people alike. The questions and comments range from sheer curiosity to outright hostility. Is he a rental? The parent of a student when I brought Sebastian to work with me, 2012. He looks nothing like you. Too often, by too many, ongoing. Tell his mother he probably won't need braces. My son's dentist, 2017. He's your son? My mother tells me I should marry a Blanquito too. An employee at Pinkberry, 2017. My old nanny used to speak Spanish to me too. A little girl at the park, after I spoke to Sebastian, 2018. These questions and comments reveal the racial chasm in our society, the notion of an us and a them. In this society, you're either white or you are not. A family like mine defies that notion. Our very existence challenges an us and them ideology. We are read as a problem. Sorry, rather than question the ideology, people question us. We are read as a problem. There can be no us without them. And rather than challenge this mindset, many in our society agree to it. I am a bilingual, Ecuadorian, Jewish American. My son is a bilingual American of Ecuadorian, Jewish, Irish, and German ancestry. All of my ancestors breathed life into me, and all of my son's ancestors breathed life into him. We are the essence of all of them. He is not a rental, he is my son. He looks quite a bit like me if you look beyond the surface. I am his mother, you can tell me. He is my son, and he is Ecuadorian and Jewish American on my side, and Irish and German American on his father's side. I'm Sebastian's mama, and I've been speaking Spanish to him since he was in my belly. The time to stop perpetuating racist narratives as if they were inherent universal truths is long past due. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those personal and what I hear from your voice, very painful stories with us. So if you can have a seat so we can continue the conversation. One of the things that I would like you to talk a little bit further about is the idea of systemic racism.
Yeah.
Because for some of our students, that may be a challenging concept to wrap their heads around.
Sure. Is this on? Yes. Okay. So systemic racism is essentially how racism is embedded into the way our culture operates, right? So in terms of our legal system, our education system, our criminal justice system, and less global, I can say, how it manifests even in interactions with each other, in the idea of who is who, and who's capable of what, who lives where, who's related to whom. So systemic racism is, I mean, the words give it away in some ways, but it is a difficult thing to understand because in some ways, the way that racism manifests in our society, the way you can see it, is very, how can I say, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's like a sleuth, you know, what's the word? Someone who creeps and sort of like you can't see them. You know something's there, you can't see it, you can't hear it, but you know it's there.
So it's very shadowy.
It's very shadowy, that's a great word for it. It's very shadowy. And honestly, in my opinion, based on my own lived experience as well as the work I've done and what I've read and what I've written, I believe systemic racism is the very foundation of how the society functions. And I think that it's the bedrock, right? Literally the ground that built the United States of America is what I think. So I see it from a different perspective because of who I am and because of the family that I have now, my husband and my son. But I certainly saw it growing up with, as Mr. Enright said, with our own experiences, with our own family. And I also think that because I'm not wholly American, I grew up going to Ecuador quite a bit when I was growing up, and I got to see how another society operates. And not to say Ecuador is a haven, there's plenty of racism in Ecuador too. I mean, this is a global issue. But it's definitely different. And so I had another way of looking at the world, another way of thinking about even who I am in the world. So I hope that explains a little bit more, just more clearly what systemic racism is.
I think I'm going to pick up and add a little bit to what you were saying. Similar to you, I dual citizenship. I grew up in 4 countries. I had a chance growing up to see what it's like to live in a different place and to think about myself differently in all of the places I lived, as I noticed how people thought about me and received me as a person.
Right.
And so one of the things that I noticed in coming to the United States is that there is racism here in a way I hadn't experienced, for instance, when I was living in Ghana as a black woman.
Right.
And I feel that the racism is in the very air that we breathe. And if you're breathing something in, you're going to breathe it out. So whether or not I want to be intentionally racist towards someone, I'm breathing out the air that I have breathed in.
Absolutely.
And so I feel that in that sense, a lot of us walk around with biases that we have, just because of the very air that we're breathing, living in the United States. And I feel that being in a different place has allowed me to see that, because I know that there are different ways of thinking about yourself and different ways of thinking about your identity.
I agree.
Yeah. As I listen to your stories about people coming up to you and assuming that your son was not your son, that you were the caretaker, because I met your son. I saw him as a baby, I've seen him as a little boy, and when I look at him, he has your eyes, he has your lips. The shape of his face is so much like you. You know, you may not have the same shade or color of skin, but I feel like the physical features, to me, looking at the two of you, you're a beautiful family, and it's evident to me. So I stop and I think about, why is it that some people, when they look at you, can see you as family,
Right.
and why others
Right.
are making those assumptions?
That's right. That's right. I often say when people assume that I'm his caretaker, especially with young children, I hold my face next to my son's so that people can actually see what Ms. Portia is saying, right? That shared physical traits. I mean, because he looks more and more like me the older he gets, in fact. I mean, when he was a baby, when you met him, he looked less like me than he does now. Not to mention, like, in so many, you know, he has gestures of mine, he has expressions of mine. But I do that purposely because I want people to actually see our faces, because I think that people only look at that superficial covering, right? His light hair, his light eyes, and his light skin versus my dark hair, dark eyes, and dark skin, and they just cannot conceive of how I gave birth to this person, right? They see this person who they deem to be a white boy, and for them it's like, there's no way. And then the fact that he speaks Spanish, he's bilingual, and then his name is Sebastian, as you heard me say. We say his name in Spanish. We also call him Sebas or Sebi. All of those set him apart, right? Like, it speaks to who he is on my side. But people really in this society particularly can't reconcile it. For them it's like, but he's white. What? You know, they can't really make sense of it. And as I said, I see it as a very different experience from how it was with my white Jewish American father. It was very different. So to me, it's very revealing what I've gotten to experience growing up with my dad and my mom and my brother, and now parenting Sebastian. It's almost as if I'm a fly in the wall, and I get to see what's happening when no one thinks that someone else is in the room. And I think it'll be that way for my son even more so, because he's presumed to be white. I'm sure people will say and do things in his presence as he gets older that they probably wouldn't if I were in the room, or if my mother were in the room. And actually, do you want the pictures?
Yes. So I've been thinking a lot about the fact that you were here at Riverdale as a teacher, you've worked as Horace Mann as a teacher, you've been in the classroom with independent school students, and I want to return back to the Adrienne Rich quote about the importance of really seeing ourselves reflected. And when you think about teaching, and you think about all of the students, whether they're coming in with the complexities of identity that you have, or whether, you know, however someone identifies, you know, I think about the way in which we as educators are in the classroom. It can either affirm or erase some of our students. And so what advice would you give to students who feel like they may be erased a little bit at school?
I think it's an excellent question. One of the first things that occurs to me in hearing your question, Ms. Portia, is the complexities of identity, right? And I've often been told by people that because my mother is from another country and I speak 2 languages and I was born one place and grew up in another place, that makes me a complex person, or somehow more, you know, a multi-layered person. And I believe that everyone is multi-layered. I don't think there's a single story to any human being on the planet. I think that every single one of us carry multiple stories about what make us who we are, right? And it's our languages, it's our traditions, it's our family structure, it's whether or not we've traveled, it's whether or not we live in a home with multi-generations, it's whether or not we have siblings, pets, right? Like, I feel like there's so many ways that people just don't know who we are. And so in my mind, and growing up, I did feel often erased in the classroom. You know, for me, it was kind of like, we're the Ecuadorian Jews. You know, it's like, I don't really see myself here, right, kind of thing. And I think that it is an educator's responsibility to ensure that all of the students in their classroom, in their school, in their community, feel affirmed, right? That you feel that you have a place here, right? And whether that place be because you grew up in a single parent home, or you were a foster child and you were adopted at 3, you know, whatever it is your story might be, I think it's a school's and an educator's responsibility to know what those stories are. And so to me, so often when we sort of jump into the work we have to do, particularly in school, you know, we have our curricula, we have our list of things to do, we have, you know, September and June, and we have a list of what we want to get done. But I think that part of that list, and perhaps high on that list, should be knowing each other and not operating on the idea that we know who people are, right? Because I think people often act on their assumptions, and to assume is not in and of itself a crime, because I think all of us do it. Every single one of us assumes, including myself. Every human being does it. But I think the difference is, do you act on that assumption or not, right? So when people see me and my son and they are curious or unsure, there are those who say something, and there are those who don't. And in some ways, I kind of think the people who don't have a sort of more sensitive and more sensible way of being, because I think you shouldn't say something that you don't know, right? If you're not sure, you can say, I don't know, is he your son, or how old is he, or whatever it is you want to say to sort of break the ice, but without sort of, you know, how long have you looked after him, right? I mean, to me, those kinds of things are shocking, right? The fact that people actually voice these things is sort of shocking to me. But I think, you know, it's just, you have to, as a teacher and as a student, make sure that you are being reflected in that classroom. Like, whatever your story, whatever the story that is important to you, whatever aspect of your story that matters most to you, should be part of that, the story of the classroom and the community.
There's often a fine line between following your curiosity and being outright rude.
Right.
I know that often my hair, for instance, is a source of curiosity for people.
Yeah.
And there's a difference for me between someone coming up and reaching their hand and trying to touch my hair, and the difference between someone coming up and saying, hey, you know, how did you get your hair like that? And so I'm trying to think about ways in which we can connect with each other, we can share stories with each other, we can follow our curiosity. If you want to talk about some of the classroom experiences that you may have had, and some of the ways in which we can do that.
Sure. So as Mr. Enright said, I taught Spanish for 8 years. I've been at Hatton Country School. And I went into it initially because I've always enjoyed engaging with both of my languages, right? I spoke English and Spanish. I've spoken English and Spanish my whole life. And for me, part of the joy of being a Spanish language teacher was I got to use my maternal language and hear it and teach it. And, but I started to realize within probably a year of teaching it that much more was part of that curriculum, which was knowing who was in the room. And so I often would have my students think about how language and culture are connected, and identity, right? Because I think that the language that we use, whether or not it's the English language or the Spanish language or words within our different languages, inform how we think. And so I would often have my kids define language, culture, and identity. I would have them write poems, soy de, I am from poems. I would have them think about, we would watch movies and talk about what was going on in the movie, you know, a movie like Stand and Deliver, or a movie like La Historia Oficial, which are movies that probably none of the students in here have necessarily seen, but some of the adults have, I'm sure. But I would, in essence, I created a curricula that allowed for my students to think more expansively, to think more broadly about who they are personally and who was in the room with them. And I think that that can be done with any subject area. I mean, I think that, you know, being a language teacher sort of lends itself in some ways more easily to that kind of examination. But I think no matter what the subject is, I think that there are ways to do that. There are ways for all of you to be thinking more about who you are, why you are who you are, the society that we live in, the history behind our society, what's going on currently, and then how to move forward in a way that actually does acknowledge and embrace people's complexity and totality, is what I think.
Would you like to share some of your pictures now?
Sure.
So this, of course, is our author.
Yes, that's me. That's my father, so that's Mr. Enright and my dad, and that was taken actually at the rehearsal luncheon right before I got married, so the day before I got married. So that's our dad. And that's my mother, and Mr. Enright's mother, and that's my son, that's Sebastian. This was taken in Ecuador actually this past summer. We were just there, my son and my husband for the first time, and me for the first time in 14 years. So it was a really, really beautiful historic trip. That's Mr. Enright, me, and my son. So I think you can probably see, as Ms. Corshi was describing, how Sebastian does actually look a lot like me. But you can also see just how light-skinned he is. And that's my husband. So that's the three of us. That's actually on my son's birthday when he turned 8 in December. So that's the three of us. And yeah, when we are out in the world, people really scratch their heads and they try and figure out how this happened, right? They're kind of like, how is it? Why is it? I actually had a student ask me, years ago, because I used to keep pictures in my classroom purposely, because I wanted people to have an association of who, I talked about my family all the time in my teaching. And I remember a kid was studying a picture of Sebastian, and that was when he was much smaller, and he was blonder when he was little, he was lighter. And he's looking at the picture, and I said, he's like, Señorita, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure, absolutely, ask me. And he says, why is your son so white? And I was not offended, and that's sort of that fine line of curiosity. I actually appreciated him asking, and I explained who he is on my side, who he is on his father's side. And he was like, wow, you never know. And I was like, exactly, you never know. So that, to me, that was a beautiful opportunity that he sort of decided to say something, because I could tell he was sort of like, should I say it, should I not say it? And I'm glad that he did. So
you talked earlier about looking around and saying, Ecuadorian, sorry about that, we're the Ecuadorian Jewish kids. And we have a number of students here with multiracial identities. It looks like I've lost this mic. So a number of students with multiracial identities. What would you say to kids who are looking around and not seeing people who are exactly like them and sharing their complex identities?
That's a good question. Well, two things. I actually have, so, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
You're good? Okay. I think two things. One is, part of what I think needs to shift is, and there's more, of course, detail that's why I think that, and how I think it can be shifted. Part of what I think needs to shift is the language specifically that we use, right? So I used to, when I was younger, I did describe myself as multiracial, and I would check other on boxes or whatever form I had to fill out, and I would write multiracial. But ever since my son was born, I actually refused to use that word, and I actually refuse to use racialized language, because I think that racialized language encourages the belief that we are inherently different from each other, and that our skin color determines who we are. Not only does it determine who we are, but it determines our experiences in life, right? Our expectations for our lived experience. And so I prefer multi-ethnic, because I believe that, right, ethnically I have many ancestors, right? Some were Jews, some were Native Americans, some were African, some were Spanish. And so I think that's one way that we can begin to think differently about our identities, whether or not you are multi-ethnic, right? But I think that specifically for people who do identify as multi-ethnic, or who have maybe a parent from one place and another parent from another, who might be a doctor or whatever the story is, I think the best, for me, the people I've connected with most in my life are people who have one foot here and one foot there. And in essence, that means, similar to what you were saying, Ms. Corshi, having the experience of existing in a different kind of society. And so I had students who were white, but who spent their summers in Israel, or spent their summers with their grandparents in Italy, right? And I think that those kinds of experiences actually do contribute to a sort of multi-ethnic experience, even if you're not literally multi-ethnic, because you have this way of thinking and being differently, right? And I think the best way for you, especially as students, as young people, is to sort of reach out for those kind of parallels, right? I mean, I think there was a time in my life where I was like, literally, where are the Ecuadorian Jews, right? It was like me and my brother, right? And then I reached a point where I'm like, I'm not actually gonna find many Ecuadorian Jews, and that's okay, right? And so my best friends are, I have one friend who is Japanese but lived in Spain, and then when she went back to Japan, went to the American school in Japan. I have another friend who's similar to me, both parents are Ecuadorian, she grew up in New York. Another friend who's half white, half black. Another friend whose parents are Indian, and she goes to India every now and then, right? And she's now married to a white man and has 2 multi-ethnic children, right? So I think that when I think about my friendships, I think these are people who are aware that there's not one single way of being in the world. And I think that, I hate to say it, but in some ways I think that American society is very much of the idea that there's one way to be, that there's one way to think. And it's like, America, our way or the highway. And not only is that untrue, but it's also destructive because it does not allow for those other ways of thinking about who you are and thinking about language and thinking about identity and even foods, like smells. You know how smells can transport you, right? I mean, I'll smell literally, it's probably gross to most people, but I smell gasoline and I think Guayaquil, I think Ecuador. And to me, it actually brings me back and I'm like, gasoline, right? It makes me happy. And my husband is always like, that's nasty, right? It's gross. I'm like, no, it's Guayaquil, it's Ecuador, it's my people, right? So I feel like even those ways of sort of, it can awaken a different part of who you are. And if we sort of give each other space to hear what those things are, right? It's like you take a bite of a blintz, I don't know, and you're like, it reminds me of my bubby or whatever it is. I feel like these are so many, to me it's more about connection. I think that people do not connect enough. They don't actually wish to understand who they're speaking to and who, what that person's story is. And they assume, she lives on the Upper East Side and she has a nanny and she, probably, goes to the Hamptons every summer and she's so rich and she's so happy and has no issues, right? And the truth is you don't know what her story is, right? Maybe that's true, but maybe her mom's really sick. Maybe her dad just died, right? Maybe her grandmother is in the hospital, right? It's like the kind of things that we just don't know who we're talking to and what their experience is. So I think that that's part of what needs to shift as well. So it's not only sort of the language we use, literally, but how we think about others and how we think about ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to some student questions now. Okay, go ahead.
So the story you mentioned before about the little girl in Central Park, like making a comment to, do you think that she was just flat out being rude, or do you think it's like the experiences she's had, or like how she's been raised?
That's an excellent question. I often don't think it's rudeness. I generally do not think it's rudeness. I especially think it's not rudeness coming from young children. I think it's her experience. I think in her experience, a brown woman with a light-skinned or white child is the nanny. Right? And so for her, there was no way to imagine I could be Sebastian's mom. So it's bigger than her, right? And I think that when people ask me these questions, be they children or not, I keep it in my mind because I wish to not respond in a way that sort of silences the person and silences the conversation. I'm not gonna lie, there are times that I have, they'll catch me on a bad day, or especially when he was younger. But the older she's gotten and the more I've thought about this and now written this, I realized that there are opportunities to have a conversation, right? And so I even said to the little girl what I said, right? I was like, he's been, he was in my belly. And she's like, he was in your belly? Right? I'm like, yeah. She's like, you're his mom. Right? I'm like, yeah. And then I hold my face. I'm like, yeah, and his dad's light skinned and my dad was light skinned, right? And so it allows for, even with that young 6-year-old child, to have a conversation that will shift, hopefully, her ideas of who's who. So no, I don't think it's rudeness, and I especially don't think, as I said, that it's rudeness coming from young children. I don't.
Okay, go ahead, your question.
With your book bringing forth the ideology of systemic racism, how do you think that in our current day, currently in history we're learning about social activism and how social like some movements can benefit a certain cause.
Right.
And specifically the one that I think relates to
question.
These are really sophisticated
Yeah,
questions.
I'm
Thank you.
impressed. I'm impressed. One thing that occurs to me, so this is my thinking. I feel that in terms of how our society has challenged racism, beginning with, not beginning with, but let's just say since the Civil Rights Movement, right? And the Black Lives Matter movement is certainly a descendant of the Civil Rights Movement, right? There's a thread that connects them. I think that part of what's missing from any movement in our history in the society around racism and systemic racism specifically is precisely how that system came to be, right? Why we had the laws we had, right? Why were interracial marriages illegal, right? Until 1967, right? And it's not a long time ago, right? So to me, part of social action and part of creating positive social change is really having a very profound understanding of what that history is. And I hate to say it, but I think that culturally we are a very sort of intentionally blind society. We choose what stories to share about our history. There's so much about history vis-a-vis systemic racism that so many people don't know, right? Like the one drop rule. Who in here knows, raise your hand, what the one drop rule is? Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good, but that's not the majority of you, right? The one drop rule was during slavery. And during slavery, the idea was if you had one drop of black blood, and you could look just like my son does, but you had one drop of known black blood, you were a slave, right? And so obviously that has changed, but the idea of one drop, right, that you are black if you have one black parent or one black grandparent makes you black, is because of that history, right? And so there's so much about our history that I think is missing from not only the conversation, but from the movements themselves. And so to me, it has to be hand in hand, where you have the movement, you have the desire, you have the energy, especially with young people, but you also have a willingness to learn about, acknowledge, and understand that history in order to truly move beyond it. Because to me, if not, it's circular. And it's kind of like we're doing the same things. And for me as a person, I was not alive during the Civil Rights Movement. I was born 1978. But it was not that long before I was born, and to now be the adult that I am during the Black Lives Matter movement, for me and what's happening currently in the country, for me there's a part that's very, very heartbreaking about it, because I think, where have we been exactly in our society? What is going on? What have we actually, achieved in our society regarding challenging racism and hopefully truly dismantling it, right? And in some ways I feel like we are far, 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 far cry from that happening. And I personally am convinced a part of how that can happen is precisely having an understanding about our thinking and how the way that we speak and the language that we use informs and actually supports the idea of racism, right? The idea that white people are more powerful, white people are superior, that just needs to change. So to me, it's twofold. I hope that answers your question.
All right, go ahead, your question.
Well, over the past few years, there's been a major fracture in just American culture and just like a major divide that even reaches down into New York City and our community. How do you think we can heal that fracture in American society to make us a true country where we are diverse and we include everyone?
Yeah. Also a good question. I think that it relates to my answer for this previous question, and I think it's really moving beyond an us and them ideology, right? That you're either here or you're there, right? And there's no space in between, right? And I think that we're all guilty of it. And so my husband's from Ohio. He's from Cincinnati. And I went to college in Ohio, and a part of me is sort of tickled that I ended up actually going back to Ohio now. Because I left pretty much like never again, right? Just as a New Yorker and whatnot. And I had noticed when I'm there, and even when I was in college, that I had certain ideas as a New Yorker that were very judgmental about the Midwest, and were very judgmental about the people in the Midwest. And some of it was justified because I was not always respected, I was not always welcome, and I was angry about it. But at the same time, I think it was unfair on my part. And so when we go now, I talk a lot about this with my in-laws and with my husband, which is that if you're not exposed to other ways of thinking, there's no way for you to imagine a different way of being, right? And so, to me, part of the fracture, as you called it, in our society, is because of sort of that chasm, that racial chasm that I described in that chapter, which is this us and this them, right? And I think it's gotten worse with our current political climate in a way that is very upsetting to me, because as a person who does exist in the middle and doesn't quite, feel at home anywhere, I often hear things that make me cringe sort of in either direction of conversations about identity and power and privilege and change. So I honestly, to me, it's all related to this history that we refuse to name. That's what I think. I think that our society just doesn't name its history and doesn't deal with how that history truly is modern day, right? Like even slavery, I mean, our current mass incarceration of Black and brown men and women is a descendant of slavery, right? There's no way to mass make that connection in order to see that even though slavery officially doesn't exist anymore, it actually kind of does, right? Because, I mean, there's an amendment in the Constitution that says you are not allowed to be enslaved unless you have been committed or been incarcerated because of a crime. So in essence, our prison system is slavery by a different name, and it's largely with Black and brown men and women. And so to me, these are elements that they exist because at certain points in history we could have had these conversations and we could have shifted the narrative, as Brian Stevenson calls it. We didn't, and so I think that's what needs to happen at all. If there's any healing to happen in our society, that has to happen. That's just what I believe. I don't believe it'll ever. Well, I don't think we'll ever heal as a nation if we don't acknowledge the original wound.
Any other questions from students or from faculty? I thought I saw another hand earlier. Okay. So go ahead. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's take a student question and then go to that.
Do you think that we could ever get to the point where we're mostly completely healed the fracture, as you were talking about earlier?
I have to hope so, right? I mean, I don't think I'll live to see that necessarily, but I also know that I can't live my life without trying. And so for me, that's become sort of my calling in a way. I feel like I'm very dedicated to it. I'm very determined about it. And I also think that you can make changes even in your own little circle of the world, right? I mean, for me, it's like I don't think I'm necessarily going to have a huge impact, sort of, culturally or societally. But at the same time, I think every conversation I have, every moment like this that I can have, to me, does create change. And so I think that that's all you can do. Like, you create the change that you wish to create in the time that you have. And hope that that sort of, that seed is planted and that it can grow beyond even your existence, is my hope. So I do think that that'll happen eventually, but I doubt I would live to see it in this society, no, I don't think so.
We'll just take one last faculty question really quickly because we're just about out of time. You have a question?
Hi, Gina.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing, was that like very difficult?
Sure. It was both difficult and actually very healing for me. Because as I said, this book was very much inspired by the experience of becoming a mother and losing my father. I was very close to my father. He was one of my best friends. In addition to being my father, he was one of my best friends. And he died quite tragically, right? He died within a year of my son's birth. And I had to find ways to not only heal from the loss, but also find a way to deal with my daily experience of being Sebastian's mother in this society. And as I began to write, and in some ways this book began as like I would post things on Facebook. I would post stories of things that had happened to us. And I had a friend say to me, she was like, you should write a book, this is a book, right? And I was like, maybe, and I started to sit down and sort of collect those stories that I had posted and sort of began to write essays and a blog, and I blog a lot about it, and I still have that blog. And so the process ended up being both healing and kind of exciting, because I felt like, hey, this is my chance to tell our story, to tell my family's story, and that we are here too, and people like us are here too, and we have a place in this conversation, and we have a place in this movement of creating positive change. So it was hard, but I loved it. I mean, I love language. You know, to me, it's like reading. I mean, I read like a book a week. I read a lot, and I love it. And I just think that, to me, words are healing. Music too. I listen to music a lot, and I often will find verses in songs that will feel to me like they have spoken directly to me, like you wrote that song for me, real kind of thing. So I find language to be a very powerful healer. And a comfort. And I also found that this is my way of giving my son his grandfather, right? Because he will never know him personally. But I think that through this book, he will have a very concrete sense of who his grandfather was and how that translates to who I am and how it translates to who he is. So it was an arduous, difficult process, but one that I found to be very healing and super exciting.
We thank you for your honesty, your vulnerability, and your truth. Thank you so much.